Hello, Gareth.
Hello, Joel.
Shall we talk about records? So, Gareth, it was record store day over the weekend. How was it for you?
Well, it was the first one in a while that I haven't actually queued up for.
Wow, you've queued before, have you?
I have, yes. It's a little bit of a confessional, this, as we begin things. But I'll be honest with you, I'm not a sort of 2 a.m. merchant. I have done 4 some years ago, but generally I was an hour or so before opening, have a bit of a natter with fellow Final fans, and then a proper browse. This time around, I don't think there was quite enough to grab my attention, but then that's fine, isn't it? You know, there's a different range of things every year. I picked up a couple of bits, so got the David Bowie one because I'm a mug and I buy whatever they release every single year for that. And I picked up a fantastic Super Furry Animals B-sides collection. And again, it's one of those where people say, oh, they just release, but I'd quite like to have those B-sides on vinyl, and they've cut them really nicely and it sounds fantastic. And it's a lovely Coke bottle clear, if you like that sort of thing, pressing on optimal. And yeah, it was very nice to pick that up. And, that was about 12 o'clock on the day, and, still some hustle and bustle, boxes being thumbed through. I imagine you were down the front at 2 a.m. though with your camping gear, were you, Joel?
Elbows pointed and at the ready. No, not quite my tempo, but I like record store day. I think it has a purpose. I did see that someone had camped out on the Thursday evening.
You got to get there early if you want the reworkings of Shed 7.
Yeah, if you need that Fleetwood Mac picture disc, I guess. But I think it has its place. I don't think it's necessarily anything I'm that keen on. I saw maybe one release. I thought, oh, I wouldn't mind that, but I'm certainly not going to queue. That makes me sound like a bit of a snob. Well, I'm not, but I think it's more of a sort of a distant uncle as opposed to my sort of world of the friendly cousins of the dusty second-hand records at the back of the shop type thing. But I think it's
absolutely. I mean, inclined to agree with you. I think it's mostly harmless. I think people who do the whole "it's record store day every day for me" kind of thing kind of miss the point. Like, if you want to go, go. If you don't want to go, don't go. And actually, it's so easy now to know what's coming up, how much it will be. You've got a rough idea of when things will get reduced, and if you need some top tips for that, then we'll have some more on that later. But it's very possible to find out in advance what sort of things are going to knock around, and nobody's forcing you out to go and pay those prices. And I appreciate there are some people who say, look, I'm a big fan, I'm a big collector, I need everything that's ever released. But these things do knock around afterwards when they're on sale online. And, I just think it produces a lovely atmosphere at record shops, and it tends to be their biggest sales day of the year.
Yeah, it's fantastic for second-hand record shops and new record shops. So the support is much needed. But as you said, we'll be revisiting this in a bit. But it wasn't just Record Store Day that had some new records out. Who else had a new release out?
Yeah, last Friday, a new album from A Certain Ratio, who are not only still going, but actually hitting a kind of prolific phase of their career. It's their lucky 13th with It All Comes Down to This. And it's their third, like I said, of the decade so far. It's quite incredible, really, that they're in such form. They did some fairly experimental stuff on their last album, but this time they're going along as the kind of core trio of Jez Kerr, Martin Moskrop and Donald Johnson. But for this one, they've kind of found a slightly more modern edge to it. And it's a really interesting thing they've done, actually. They've gone for Dan Carey on production, who listeners might know from his work with people like Black Midi and K Tempest and Wet Leg. I think you can tell that sort of slightly no messing, draw out the true heart of the band approach that Carey is known for has definitely played a part on this record. But yeah, a band people have definitely heard of. Was it one for you?
I've sold a lot of A Certain Ratio records within the shop, but yeah, I think you're right. I could really tell they're working with a new producer, and I really appreciate that 13th album, 4th decade of their career, 5th maybe? I can't quite add up, but there's this sense of a band still hungry, still wanting to do something. Now, I did get a sense it must be frustrating for bands who are of this ilk to... You could imagine in the 80s working so hard to get those really truly authentic sounds and it being all proper audio and leads everywhere, whereas it probably clicks on a button now and they can probably create the very same thing. But I could hear some attempts to really try and capture something authentic and exciting. I can't imagine I'm going to listen to it that often, but no, I think I like the idea of A Certain Ratio a bit more than maybe the music.
And I really do think there's a tremendous atmosphere there. And you mentioned that idea of trying to get those sounds. And the atmospherics was the thing I think that hooked me in. And as you say, I'm not sure necessarily it's going to be something that gets totally, massively frequent rotations on the turntable. But it really did suck me in. It's one of those records where I think just you listen to the entire thing from start to finish, and it does build a world. The title track's great. There's a track called Out From Under that's fantastic. And Dorothy Says, which is inspired by Dorothy Parker. They're probably the most striking moments if you want to get a bit of a sample of what it sounds like. But it sounds good, partly because they got Jason Mitchell at Loud in as well, who's doing a fantastic job on the mastering. It's got a really rich, deep bottom end, as you would imagine, and that is really nicely done. It's chunky, but not smeary. It doesn't obliterate everything else. It holds its own in the soundstage. And then the mids and those all-important little percussive details sound fantastic. And on top of that, it's a really quiet, optimal pressing, which is all the more notable, Joel, because it's on bio-vinyl.
Bio-vinyl. Tell us more about bio-vinyl, Gareth.
Well, indeed. Not only does it come in a lovely compostable outer bag rather than the usual shrink wrap, but the disc itself is from bio-based PVC. And the big difference is they don't use petroleum in the manufacture of it. Instead, they used recycled used cooking oil. Now, at that point, you read all these things, you think, noble endeavours, and I've tried various different things where they've done, eco-vinyls of various different types. And these compounds are interesting, but they're not always that quiet. This one, however, very nice indeed. Played very quietly, very quietly. So, musically interesting, lovely soundstage, and a quiet pressing. So if a certain ratio are for you, then I think you'll be very happy with this new album from a vintage artist. And vintage artists will concern us a little bit more now as we go digging in the world of second-hand records.
We will indeed, but first I have just to acknowledge the very strange sound I made when you just said how quiet that release was, but I wanted to acknowledge I know how much you appreciate a quiet pressing.
Indeed I do.
So I'm going to take a little bit of a look onto online sales and the world of eBay and PopPsych, and just wanted to bring the listeners here something that may catch your eye when you're out and about, looking for charity shops or even your own collection, that you might not know that you're sitting on a bit of a golden nugget. Many people listening to this will have a copy of Led Zeppelin 2, but did you know that the early US pressings were the Ludwig hot mixes?
Now, what is a Ludwig hot mix, Joel?
So Robert Ludwig, legendary mastering engineer, he mastered Led Zeppelin 2, and he got a little bit carried away. A little bit too much bottom end, a little bit too much punch, and it was really, it was making people think there was something wrong with their turntable. So pause, let's quickly get this remastered, get it back out into the world. But these Ludwig hot mixes have become quite sought after because now there are stereos that can handle such a hot mix. But they're very hard to find in good condition, or near mint condition as it would. You can pick up copies for around about £100, but this one did seem to be in rather fantastic condition. It sold for just under four figures, £959. So if you're going to look into that dead wax in between the music and the label and you see an RL within a circle, you might have a little small fortune in your hand there.
And it's lovely, isn't it, this? It gets to the heart of collecting, where if it's a band you love and an album you love, then, okay, you are paying for the status of owning this, but clearly it is the version to hear if you want to hear what that album could sound like, because, this Ludwig hot mix was clearly how it was supposed to sound, and then they had to walk it back because of the issues with the technology. And it's exactly what's been happening with a lot of the Blue Note reissues as well. They're now making them sound how they should sound rather than how they had to sound because of the gear that they were being listened to on.
I love that, because people always talk about authenticity and what's being authentic then to actually capture what the band and the artists and the engineers wanted, as opposed to what the vinyl or the equipment could handle at the time. But now for something a little bit different, because there was another release from the US, but this is a band who, I have a soft spot for what I call the one and done. A band who have just released one single or one album, never to be heard of again. And during the week, there was a single sold on eBay for $759 by a band called Dorian Gray.
Dorian Gray, of course. Yes.
Of course.
Dorian Gray. Everybody knows Dorian Gray.
Well, they had a little 7-inch single, the only thing they released back in 1985, called Lonely Pride. And I don't think I've heard many American bands from the 80s that had such an influence from UK bands of the same era. Very Ultravox, very Human League, OMD, quite minimal no wavy in places, very synth led. I thought this was a cracking little track. And what I'm trying to do with these sections within the podcast is just bring something you likely would not have heard before.
It was a fascinating listen, actually. It's one of those strange songs where as soon as you hear it, it sounds weirdly familiar, but I guess that's exactly because of the influences you just mentioned. You know, I couldn't quite pin it down. I suppose that's because it's that kind of mental jukebox thing where you mold together bands that you think have certain things in common and you almost stitch their songs into one big patchwork. And then somehow this song sounded like that patchwork of numerous bands from around that time, slightly wobbly sounds, slightly kind of reedy vocal to it, atmospheric feel to it. It's a really interesting song, but I'd probably draw the line at £759.
Yeah, especially one in this condition, because it was far from in great condition. It was very crackly. They'd put up a clip of the audio. Didn't even have the sleeve. But I just always get so fascinated by these artists. What did the members of Dorian Gray go on to do? Did they were vets? Did one go on to run a rehearsal studio? Did one of them become a roadie? But those early synth, like minimal no-wave bands, I'm always fascinated because very rarely do they use click tracks, you know, and there's this really sort of authentic recording sound to it, but it's obviously all very quite synth-led. It's like when you listen to early Depeche Mode or even Bronski Beat, you know, you can hear them going out of time. You can hear them just trying to pull it back. And I thought this really captured that. Yeah, a beautiful little single. If you have a copy of Lonely Pride by Dorian Gray, well, drop me a line because I might make you a little offer on that, actually.
One of the things we're regularly going to do is check in with some of the nation's independent record shops, and to kick off our Hello from the Shop Floor feature, we're going to hear from Raves From The Grave, a shop in Frome in Somerset, and they're going to give us a bit of an update on how things have been in Record Store Day week. So without further ado, let's hand over to Tom.
Hey Gareth and Joel, it's Tom here at Raves From The Grave in Frome, just checking in to chat about Record Store Day. Raves has taken part in every Record Store Day with the exception of the very first year, and since COVID it's grown massively. It's quite astonishing really how much bigger it's getting, and this Record Store Day was our busiest day ever in the shop, and with over 100 people queuing prior to opening. It's just mind-boggling that it's getting to the scale it is. I think one thing that really helps us is because we're known for stocking a large range year-round of new releases and back catalogue titles. When it comes to Record Store Day, we also choose to keep a big range of those titles too. This year we're about sort of 80 to 90% really of what was available we had in stock. This definitely attracts people to come and see us. As with every Record Store Day every year, there's always some big sellers. You know, this year, Olivia Rodrigo, Noah Kahan, Blur, Fleetwood Mac, all the ones you'd really expect to see up there have done well for us. But obviously, we also get some that are less good sellers for us. This year, things like The Charlatans, Talking Heads and Cranberries didn't do so well. And sort of the legacy artists where the product feels a bit overpriced, they struggled for sure. Overall, it's really a fantastic day for us at Raves and for all indie record shops across the country and worldwide, you know, and to see so many people out supporting them is fantastic. We'd not be here if it wasn't for people coming in to us for Record Store Day and for people who come in year round, not just Record Store Day, but week in, week out, coming to buy new releases. You can find us online on all the usual social media platforms, plus we're online at ravesfromthegrave.com, or just come and visit us in the shop.
Thank you, Tom. Well, that's really interesting, actually. It's always fascinating to hear what things sold well and what things didn't. But there was something else released new recently, was there not, Gareth? Do tell us.
Well, we mentioned Blue Note earlier, didn't we, as we were talking about the remastering, making things sound how they're supposed to sound. And one of the series that I suspect we'll talk about quite a lot on here over time is the Tone Poet series, which is the kind of fancy audiophile reissue of Blue Note titles, done to the style of some US approaches that were done about 5-10 years ago that were even more expensive to import. And those go around sort of 35 to 40 quid. So they are not cheap. Alongside that, though, runs the Blue Note Classic series. And they are a little bit cheaper, sort of more in the £25 area. And those are pressed at Optimal in Germany. They come with polylined inner sleeves. And reassuringly, considering how many reissues look like they've just been photocopied by being scanned in or something rather than beautifully recreated, the artwork looks fantastic too. The one that I'm going to pick out this month is from an artist who I have an incredible soft spot for, which is Bobby Hutcherson, something of a vibes maestro from the world of Blue Note, and it is the album Happenings from 1967. Listeners, I'm sure, will recognise its distinctive bright pink cover, and I would certainly argue that the music is no less striking, but knowing that you've yet to have your jazz phase, Joel, I'm curious to see what you thought.
Yeah, I think we're a couple of decades away from my jazz phase. I gave this a spin as I went for a walk in the forest this morning. And Bobby, if you're listening, now look, I am sorry. This wasn't for me. I hope you're not going to be too upset, but I struggle with vibes. I struggle with jazz. And when you put the two together, well, I'm leaving the room.
Sorry, Bobby, because of course I'm sure you are. The key thing about this for me is the way the ensemble works, and like I said, I love vibes. I think when he's in his moment, it's quite remarkable, and the associated kind of team on this, you got Bob Crancher on bass, Joe Chambers on drums, and incredibly Herbie Hancock in there on piano. It's Hancock's Maiden Voyage that opens up side 2. The rest are all Hutcherson tracks. Songs like Aquarium Moon and Arrojo, as I believe you're supposed to pronounce it. True Fire from Hancock on Aquarium Moon, just the two of them going at each other. And then there's a track at the end of the album called The Omen where the instructions were basically just do your own thing, see how it goes. Now, I know that if you like jazz, that's part of the reason why you like it. And if you don't like jazz, that's almost certainly the reason why you don't like it. But they find their own space, and crucially with Blue Note, the soundstage is all about space. Some people have issues with the way the stereo sound stage was very much kind of broad and open and very clearly positioned. But the space in the room that you get from these all analog cuts, they are going back to the tapes and making them sound as good as they possibly can. Really, honestly, that closing track, The Omen, is quite something to behold. Kevin Gray is the American mastering engineer that audiophiles will know and love already, and we'll certainly mention him more times here, I'm sure. Does the cuts for these, and it's as I said, an optimal pressing, which is pretty much near silent throughout. And just, in terms of presenting this music, I think getting these classic albums back out there, relatively affordable with just such incredible sound. While it may not be for Joel, I imagine for those of you that are jazz heads out there, that'll be one to pick up. Perhaps there's something more Joel that has happened in the world of music this week that he can tell us about now.
Well, I was just reflecting about how we possibly couldn't have timed this better to be the episode number 1 of the Plural Pod, and for us to go from something where you feel very safe to somewhere where I feel very safe as I introduce you and welcome you into the world of horror punk and Samhain, or as some would pronounce, Sown. So this was the band that Glenn Danzig formed after leaving the Misfits, absolutely legendary New York punk band who, with their theatrics and their hair and their makeup, were just the leaders of, in my opinion, of the American punk movement. Split acrimoniously after releasing just a handful of records, all of which go for ridiculous amounts of money. Danzig went on to form Samhain, and this album, would you mind helping me here, Gareth? Initium?
Initium, I think, is it? But I mean, it's one of those, isn't it? How are you meant to know when you see these things written down?
Yeah, you expect to read them. So this was the debut album, and this has a fantastic story behind it, which I thoroughly enjoyed researching, because the band were about to go on tour. They had no stock, so they drive over to the pressing plant, ready to confront the staff, to find that the pressing plant was closed. And only the manager was left getting in his car, and they stopped him from leaving. They forced him to open the pressing plant, and then the band themselves pressed the second pressing of their debut album.
I imagine that went really smoothly, surely. I mean, what could go wrong?
Yeah. And subsequently, what happened was there was many variants and misprints, and pellets were used, and you had these streaks in the black version, you had pink versions that should have been red, and then subsequently, because of the story around this, these versions have become so sought after, so that last week a copy of the pink pressing, which should have been red, sold for £6,200. Blimey.
That is a lot of money considering what the grooves contain.
Yeah. The recordings themselves, as you were saying about Blue Note, there's so much room. There's so much soundscape. What was it you said to me earlier, Gareth?
I described the music, having had a listen, as if it was recorded on a dictaphone whilst being performed in a bin or a cave, perhaps, where the various members of the band couldn't get very close to each other.
I'm just imagining that moment where they're all sitting in the studio listening back to the mixes, and you're kind of thinking, is anyone going to say how bad this sounds, or do we just have no time? We've run out of money. But with many of these records, you're not buying it for the soundscape or the music, you're buying it for the story. And what a story. Danzig went on to have a solo career. Rick Rubin produced. Misfits continued with various vocalists, and then just a few years ago, they reformed with Danzig and played huge festivals out in America. I'm still waiting for some to bring them over to the UK, and I will be there. And hopefully before then, I'll maybe have a nice Sam Hain or Sown to some, or even a nice early Misfits single to bring along. Because if I can get Danzig and the original members to sign it, oof, we compete with that sort of money. So what's going to be a regular feature here on the Plural Pod is going to be checking in with vinyl records' very own Martin Lewis. That's Tom at Cheap Indie Vinyl. Tom, are you there?
Since I started the Cheap Indie Vinyl Twitter account a few years, it's become a bit of a game to try and predict when the record store day discounts would start to roll in. I don't think anybody predicted the answer to that this year would be a whole 3 days. Sounds of the Universe on Tuesday night ran a flash sale for a few hours where they knocked 50% off selected titles. There were some big hitters in there, like the Gorillaz Deluxe version of Cracker Island. Like I say, that offer will have been closed by the time you hear this, but I think it's a pretty good indication that by the time we get to the weekend, we'll start to see lots of discounts elsewhere. The best way to keep up to date with those is to follow the Cheap Indie Vinyl Twitter account, which is at Cheap Indie Vinyl. If you're not on Twitter, I don't want to be recommending that you join Twitter in 2024. It's awful. So I've set up a WhatsApp channel as well. You'll find a link to that in the episode description. And if you follow that channel, you'll get links to sales at the UK's best independent record stores on your WhatsApp, as and when I find out about them. Blur released a Zoetrope picture disc single disc edition of Parklife for Record Store Day. I had a look at the Discogs reviews earlier. It doesn't sound very good, and I watched some videos of it on Twitter. It doesn't look very good either. It might be a coincidence, but that Record Store Day release seems to have triggered a price drop at Sister Ray of the 2012 2LP version, which sounds brilliant. It's in a gatefold sleeve, so it looks beautiful as well. That's available for £29.99 at Sister Ray, so that's sisterray.co.uk. Not necessarily cheap, but significantly cheaper than your major retailer, where you can expect to pay double that. So if you want a copy of Parklife, grab one from Sister Ray at that price as soon as you can. Outside of Record Store Day, Norman Records have a reduced records promotion on. Yard Axe The Overload is available for £12.49. Beth Gibbons and Rustin Man's Out of Season is available for £15.49. And Fat Pot by Paul Weller is available for £10.49. There's a couple of dozen other records available there, so it's well worth checking that one out. Finally, every week I'm going to be picking a £15 or under banger of the week. I've actually picked two this week, and they're available from Vinyl Guru at vinylguru.co.uk. The Cure, a lot of their early albums have been discounted quite heavily in places recently. Unsurprisingly, they've all been snapped up elsewhere, but Vinyl Guru have got some of those left at the cheaper price. So you can get Pornography for £14.99 and Three Imaginary Boys for £14.99 too, which is significantly cheaper than elsewhere. They're both the single disc editions. I think they were reissued in 2016. I've got them. They sound really good, and you can't really go wrong at that price. So those are this week's £15 or under bangers of the week, and I'll be back with more next week.
Tom, I mean, he's a legend, isn't he, Gareth?
He's a good man, and it's wonderful that we've managed to get him to join us for this adventure. And, you know, brace yourselves. He's very good at finding tempting things upon which you will find yourself spending your money.
Indeed, brace yourselves, because it's time for the final review. Gareth, over to you.
Yes, let's go with an artist that famously, whenever people express opinions about their work, it's always really, really well received. So buckle up, everybody. It's Taylor Swift time. This week saw the release of the Tortured Poets Department without an apostrophe for some reason. And there were multiple vinyl editions announced well in advance, each with a different bonus track. They were often the usual short-term way that Taylor Swift does, 48-hour window to order, all this kind of stuff. Then magically, after a few weeks, they were all available again for another couple of days for you to order so that you could get your exclusive vinyl editions. And then once it was actually released, they were available again this time in shops. So the shops, having been frozen out of these pre-sales, are now offered these special editions, and each version had an extra bonus track, and it was a different one, it was a different colour. And then suddenly these were now available to the shops as well, presumably because they had extra stock knocking around. So on top of all of this, people talking about all these different versions, on the day it was actually released onto the streaming services, Taylor Swift then dropped, as I believe the young folk are saying, an additional section called the Tortured Poets Department Anthology, which added another 57 minutes of music to the end of an album that is already arguably too long at 65 minutes. And some have argued this was apparently epic trolling of those who'd already formed an opinion and written their review of the record and said what all the songs meant. I would argue, as a podcast that is primarily about the pursuit of vinyl records, that it's also somewhat trolling of a rabid fandom who've been very kindly and keenly buying up all of these special editions in the weeks leading up to release, who now find out that half of the album isn't actually available on a physical format yet. So, much anticipated. How excited were you on the day, Joel?
Well, before I tell you how excited I was, I think it's the word "yet" that I'm somewhat fearful of, because one imagines the quadruple vinyl box set is somewhat in the works and clogging up the manufacturing as I talk. So I am of a man of a certain age with a moustache. Taylor Swift is someone that I don't tend to listen to, but I did. Well, I wanted the opportunity to listen to this because I wanted to prepare, and there were parts that I really appreciated. But then I was just kind of taken by how very samey it is and how very somewhat dull. And I don't mean dull as in there's not these sort of big sweeping moments and this big sort of soundscape, but just dull and how very samey it was. And then I realised how very little singing there was. There would be these sort of many kind of spoken parts, almost like a rap, and then these big ethereal vocals. And I go, this is Blondie's Rapture. It is Blondie's Rapture. We've got these sort of big serial vocals and then just sort of semi-raps. I was really taken by it. I can't imagine I'm going to revisit it anytime soon. I did appreciate the fact that it has an impact, and Taylor, as the world's biggest music artist at the moment, has an impact. So it has a reflection of, where America and Western society is at the moment. But that's perhaps for another podcast. But yeah, that's where I stood on this.
And there you go. You see, Taylor Swift fans, you thought he didn't like it, but then he described it as the rapture. Now, how does it sound? Well, the record itself is let's get some songs and then we'll talk about the vinyl pressing. You mentioned about the samey sound, and I don't have a moustache, so I actually know a little bit more about Taylor Swift's work. The main album is mostly produced by Jack Antonoff, and those who are scholars of Swift will know that his production has been all over her more recent work, and he does tend to make songs sound quite similar to each other, and so that production is layered across this. And I did find myself on a few occasions not realising that we'd moved from one song to the next, and that kind of speaks to what you were saying a moment ago, Joel. The bonus section, the bit that dropped on the day of release a few hours later, weirdly, most of those 57 minutes is produced with the National's Aaron Dessner, who worked with Taylor Swift on the two albums Folklore and Evermore from 2020, which have got an awful lot of admiration from beard-stroking folk and brought in a few people that perhaps weren't natural Taylor Swift fans. I think they are incredible records. They're amongst my favourite of hers, along with 1989. Just beautiful, beautiful songs with lovely textures to them. And interestingly, his work with her is almost entirely consigned to the bonus bits. So if you're buying the 2 LP set, you're not getting most of those songs. The LPs themselves, you've got an opener, Fortnight, which features Post Malone. It's kind of machine-tooled, typical slow-burn earworm thing that Swift has become so adept at, but kind of feels slightly throwaway the number of times she does it, but it is incredibly memorable. There are some great songs on there, So Long London, really nice. There are some lyrical issues at times, which a number of people have pointed out whilst commenting on the album. I'm far from a prude when it comes to music, but some of the swearing feels almost crowbarred in, which just, it seems illogical, but she still can turn a phrase. Track like But Daddy, I Love Him is tremendous, and, she genuinely turns on the fans who, film videos where they tell her who she can be in love with and who she can go out with and all this kind of stuff. And she takes aim at that. And there's a great little line in there. I tell you something about my good name. It's mine alone to disgrace. And, oddly enough, that's one of the tracks that Dessner is involved in. The vinyl cut, you'll be pleased to know, Joel, is very good.
Thank goodness.
It's a long way from that folklore edition that many people have experienced that had some issues with distortion and groove problems. Ryan K. Smith and Joe Nino Hernes at Sterling have done a grand job of it. There's a good wide open sound stage, good control of the bottom end of it, but plenty of nuance and huge kind of 3D shaping of Taylor Swift's voice, as you would imagine. Optimal have pressed the full European range of versions. So mentioned earlier that there are different variants: Phantom Clear, Smoky Grey. There is Ink Black, or Black, as most people call it. The various different versions each have a different track at the end of it. So for this, because I am committed, Joel, I spend my time wisely for this. I sampled 2 different versions for us. Had a listen to the Phantom Clear, which I have to say played pretty quietly throughout. Tiny little bit of surface noise here and there, but otherwise sounded pretty good. Also tried the Smoke Grey version with the Albatross as the bonus track. I found that to be a bit noisier. Whether that means that instinctively one is more noisy than the other, or it's just potluck, as can be the way these days, I don't know. But the vinyl package itself, I have to say, it is very well done. Proper full-size gatefold, lots of artwork, and then inside a full 12-inch by 12-inch booklet that is glued inside the gatefold, reminiscent of those fantastic 1970s gatefold records. So, you know, it's a pretty great pressing of the less interesting half of this project. There's stuff to like, and it will probably grow, but will it have that long-lasting capacity that many of her records have in the past? I guess only time will tell.
Will you revisit this record often?
I will certainly stay with it for a little while, because I think I'm also almost certainly going to end up weirdly listening to it on streaming, because I want to hear those second batch of songs. Because, you know, with 31 songs, when you're listening to it, you know, you're listening to see what it sounds like, but it kind of feeling a little bit like homework. So, you know, the second half, I think, is where I will spend my time.
What I look forward to revisiting this again when we have the quadruple vinyl edition to go listen to. So it's the week after the night before. It's Record Store Day was just a week ago, and we're wondering if you regret any of your purchases. Have you got a headache?
Is there a great thing that you picked up that you'd like to tell people about? Or, from record store days gone by, are there certain items that you look at on the shelf and cannot quite believe that at one point that was you? That was the thing that you had to have. If you've got stories from record store day, good or bad, or explanations of why it is that it means so much to you, then let us know, please. There are several ways to get in touch.
You can find us on Twitter. We're at Plural Vinyl Pod.
And if you wish, you can drop us an email, pluralofvinylpod@gmail.com.
And there's also a WhatsApp number, which you'll find on the Twitter. So I think that's pretty much it, is it, Gareth?
I think so. Yeah, let's pack the pod up. Let's go. Oh,
what's that?
There was something. As we speak right now, just this moment, how much is Part Life in HMV?
£59.99.